Hi, everyone. My name is Christina Cardona, and I am the co-director of the Community Book Connection, which is sponsoring this event. Our current book is Wild Tongues Can't Be Tamed, which is a nonfiction short essays from the Latinx diaspora. And to speak here today, we have Vanessa Moses, who is the community and engagement specialist for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and does uh, research for the Nature Conservancy. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you to Vanessa. I pass the floor on to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As Professor Cardona just stated, my name is Vanessa Moses. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm currently the Community and Engagement Specialist at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. All right, my slides aren't uh, changing with my keypad. So give me 1 second here. There we go, I have to click the screen. So I did write a brief agenda because I am a big talker. So some things that I like to overview today is my background and interests, how I got into environmental justice work and eventually joined CBF, this nonprofit that I currently work for. I'll be talking about my education and teaching experience, my role as a historical interpreter for the Nature Conservancy, my work as an environmental educator, and how that furthers environmental justice within nonprofits, and my current role in community and partnerships, which is the name of the department that I work for in CBF. And at the conclusion of this, I will also leave time for questions. Now, if someone has a misunderstanding, if they didn't catch something that I said, I encourage you to raise your hand virtually. That can pause me and I can reiterate something that I said. But I do ask that we hold questions to the end because I'm kind of scatter-minded and squirrel brained. And so I can get sidetracked if we start asking a lot of questions at the start. So to introduce myself a little bit further, I was born and raised on the Eastern Shore of Virginia. A lot of people that I meet in Maryland are familiar with the Eastern Shore of Maryland, such as Ocean City. The Eastern Shore of Virginia is attached to the Eastern Shore of Maryland. It is a 70-mile peninsula. It is narrow and is bordered by the Atlantic Ocean on the east and Chesapeake Bay on the west. So I grew up in a rural community. For context, my graduating class in high school had 130 graduates, and I knew every single one of them by name as well as by experience. I know most of those students since elementary school. While attending public school growing up, I was a student at Chesapeake Bay Foundation's Port Isabel Island Center, which is located on Tangier Island, Virginia. That is an island in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay. And it was one of my first true outdoor excursions, and it started my interest in conservation. After high school, I went on to study environmental thought and practice, and I double majored in African American studies at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia. It was a quite bougie, quite prestigious institution that I found was not a good fit culturally, but I found my way through academics and by finding friends that had similar interests. While starting my career as a student, the Flint water crisis took place in Michigan. And during my time at UVA, there were the Unite the Right rallies. I personally see it as violence in Charlottesville 2017. So that definitely impacted my student experience. I took on jobs and other internship opportunities through the UVA Rotunda, which is our longstanding library, is the centerpiece of our university, and it is a longstanding library at that institution. I was an orientation leader, so when students joined and transfer students came to the university, I showed them along the path. I showed them our major sites, how to get started with their classes, and shared some of my own student experiences. I was also a member of a student environmentalism group. There, I protested the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. For those of you who may not be familiar, The Atlantic Coast Pipeline was a pipeline that was proposed to go through the states of North Carolina, Virginia, I believe West Virginia, and Maryland. Through that student activism and the activism of locals, shown here in the bottom right corner of this slide, we were actually able to prevent the formation of that pipeline, which, as many of you know, is quite rare in the environmental justice movement. And as I concluded my college career, I got accepted to the Peace Corps. COVID-19 hit, and then I began teaching in Baltimore City schools because I could not go to a Peace Corps due to COVID, which is kind of crazy. So, continuing on. One of my first, I would say, breakout roles in my career is my work with the Brownsville African American History Project that was initiated by the Nature Conservancy's Vulgenal Virginia Coast Reserve, located in Nassawattix, Virginia. So Nassawattix is actually not far from where I grew up. It's only about 20 miles from my childhood home. And I actually moved back to the Eastern Shore of Virginia during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I began teaching as an English teacher in Baltimore City after I graduated. I found that it was not the right fit for me, and COVID made it especially challenging. I also got COVID and got quite sick. And so around the June of 2022, I decided to move back to the Eastern Shore and take on this project, research in African American history for the Nature Conservancy. For more context, the Vulgenal Virginia Coast Reserve is a preserve contained by the Nature Conservancy through land conservation easements. These are documents that people often, it's basically like a land document or land preservation ethic preserved when someone passes away. So some people, when they die, they pass all their assets along to other organizations or to family members. In this case, when people pass along, they donate their land to the Nature Conservancy to put conservation easements on them to prevent construction of like things that would be a detriment to the environment. So if it's on marshland, it would be preventing construction and filling of marshlands. In this case, the Brownsville Preserve maintains 13 barrier islands on the Eastern Shore of Virginia, which is kind of crazy to think of. And the barrier islands are a chain of 13 islands along the coast of Virginia on the Atlantic side, and they serve as this huge buffer in the event of hurricanes and other climate events. So the key elements of this project were quite unique. It was one of the first times that TNC, a mostly land conservancy based organization, focused on the history of individuals, of people, specifically enslaved individuals. So as I took on this role, it was a short-term project of 6 weeks. We plan to recognize the overlooked responsibilities of TNC as a land preservation organization. We wanted to activate local Eastern Shore residents like myself to tell local stories. We wanted to acknowledge the first environmental stewards, which were enslaved African Americans on that land, as well as including those descendants of the enslaved, as well as the white Upshurs who still exist and are still aware of their family ties to this historic home. So you'll see that there's a picture in my slide as well. It's not the best quality picture. It's an old picture from about 1910 of the old house. That was one of the first structures built on Brownsville Preserve. And it was the home of the white Upshurs who became quite notable in the history of Virginia. Several were doctors. One was a Secretary of State, I want to say during the early 1800s, around 1801. And he died in a cannon accident, which is kind of crazy. So if you're a big history buff, you can look up the history of the Upshurs in Virginia after this. I'm really excited to dive into some of the work that I did with this project. What I was most excited for is showing how the history of African Americans is key and core to the history of environmental stewardship. I think oftentimes we think of tree plantings, we think of protesting the degradation of forests and other environmental areas as environmental justice work. But recognizing the first stewards, the first people who worked the land, the ways in which they worked the land, the remnants of that labor, It's also an element of environmental justice as well. So with this project, we started to document some of the lives and contributions of these enslaved laborers. We tried to figure out what type of farming, what type of animals they may be rendered at that time, as well as including some of the descendants in the decision-making process of dispersing some of the things that we found. For additional context of slavery at Brownsville, we documented slavery through the birth dates of mothers that were found in the property statements and property taxes of the white Upshur family. Kind of crazy to think about, but again, at that time, enslaved people were documented as property. Now, oftentimes these birth dates were only connected to nicknames. So, in engaging in genealogical research of African Americans, oftentimes a fair amount of assumptions and, and associations have to be made because there's often a lack of physical documents proving certain interactions among Black people and the white people that owned them. Sorry. Many people that were enslaved at Brownsville actually served in the Civil War. That was one of the standout findings of my research. I found over 13 service records for Black people of Brownsville, which is really cool to see. And I also could connect it to the time of the roles and responsibilities of these people. I could connect to not only Brownsville, but other places that were sites along the Civil War. So Texas was a big one. And it's crazy to think that like Brownsville is in Virginia, but a lot of these people actually ended up in Brownsville, Texas, which are like, what are the chances? Secondly, I had to engage in research of burial traditions of the time, because at this time, there were no family plots for African Americans and for slaves. Oftentimes, when someone was buried, a yucca plant was planted in their stead, like right above the remains. And that is one of the ways we have speculated where some of the remains of these African Americans are. It's also been able to document some of that post-war relocation around the time of the Civil War. As I said before, a lot of people from the Eastern Shore ended up in Texas, as well as Connecticut for the Upshur descendants. Some of my standout discoveries were that at the time of enslavement on the Eastern Shore, the white Upshur family from the year 1801 to about 1850 had over 90 individuals in that 50-year span. That was a standout along the Eastern Shore. Most white residents of the Eastern Shore who had a slave had 5 or less in their lifetime. And so for the Upshur family to own over 90 individuals in a 50-year span, they were one of the wealthiest families on the Eastern Shore at that time. I was also able to document movement through marriage records of free Blacks in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Those are some cool records to deep dive into, as well as oral histories. Being from the shore, I reached out to some people, Black people with the last name Upshur, and I was able to interview them as well. On this slide, I have one of my favorite documents that I found in Fold 3, which is a government website used to store records of soldiers. And so on this document, on the top right, the listed name is Alfred Upshur. This was a misspelling of Upshur, likely due to this person's Eastern Shore accent. I can relate. It states that this person was 17 years old, 5'7", complexion Black, eyes Black, hair Black, birthplace. In many places where it said Northampton County, Virginia, this is the first document that stated Brownsville, Virginia, as being the birthplace of this enslaved individual. At the time of his enlistment, he wrote his occupation as farmer. Of course, that refers to being forced to work land that they did not own. After my 6-week stint with the Brownsville Preserve on my history research, I actually was able to extend my research even further, another additional 6 weeks, totaling 12 weeks, because I was finding such cool things. And at the conclusion of my service with the Nature Conservancy, I took on another job in conservation with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. As I stated before, back in middle school, I was a student at Port Isabel. Oops, excuse me. And now I had the opportunity to serve as a teacher at Port Isabel, which was truly a full circle moment. So you'll see here some photos of students in our marshland, students marsh mucking, which is exploring and playing in the marsh mud. You'll see me working with students, cracking open an oyster, dissecting an oyster, and talking about the inner workings of that filter feeder, as well as a picture on the bottom right, me with my fellow staff members on our boats, all decked out in the same t-shirt that day. In this role, I developed skills in teaching to diverse audiences, as well as hosting middle school and high school students. Our island centers with CVF also teach teachers. And so in the summertime, I worked with adults. I learned the inner workings of the organization that I now work for, which was super important to helping me form relationships and eventually apply to my current role. I was a member of the staff DEIJ committee, which has now been renamed the Staff WAVES Committee, working to achieve our values in every space. I created this student swim cap initiative, and you'll see that some students in that top left photo, underneath their hoodies, if you have good eyesight, you can see that they have on swim caps. That is to protect their hair from that mud while we marsh muck. Because while on these 3-day trips, students are not allowed to shower. So to help with that ick factor of getting all dirty and not being able to bathe, we started to provide swim caps for our students. Last but not least, in my role as an African American woman from the Eastern Shore, teaching students from all across the watershed, I had the opportunity to serve as a mentor, as well as an example of how people of color can join the conservation field and how we can serve as leaders and representation in that field. All right. Currently, I work as a community engagement specialist. And right here, I have a Venn diagram describing the differences between our communities and partnerships department and our HR department. So I took all my skills that I developed while teaching, as well as learning the inner networks of CBF. You all should know the Chesapeake Bay Foundation is one of the longest standing conservation organizations dedicated to the preservation of Chesapeake Bay. And as a quite large organization, we have over 200 employees. People can utilize their passion for conservation in different ways. In addition to education and the community and partnerships departments, we have departments in environmental protection and restoration. We have a litigation department that takes all those big cases to the federal offices or to state offices in terms of legislation for clean air and clean water. We have an IT department, which includes a GIS department, which is a growing field and a needed field in the realm of climate change. Our GIS specialists track the impact of wave action and erosion along the Chesapeake Bay. I think I'm probably missing a department or two. Oh, we have administrative departments, of course, as well as the human resources department, which I've outlined in this Venn diagram with the communities and partnerships, just so you can see the differences between what a community and a partnerships department does versus a human resources department. So we both seek to create an inclusive workplace, create safe spaces for our employees, create inclusive workplace practices, as well as serve as official departments within the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. However, we defer in how we achieve these goals. The Human Resources Department has a scope that is solely internal. It works with dealing with staff members from the moment that they have that entry interview to the moment that they exit the organization. While the scope of the Communities and Partnerships Department is both internal and external, hence that name partnerships. So not only do I work internally with the WAVES committee that was formerly the DIJ committee, I report to the Board of Trustees, so about every 3 months. All of our accomplishments and our goals are documented and passed on to the decision-making body of Chesapeake Bay Foundation. But we also facilitate the training of unconscious bias. We'll have future trainings involving bias as well. We help our staff members give land acknowledgements through education and researching what people were where within the watershed and within the places where we operate. And lastly, we seek to develop a more engaged community and a more thorough history through recognizing the site history of all the different offices and education centers that CBF occupies. So I want to take a pause there to allow for any questions at this moment in regards to all of those things I just talked about. I feel like that was a mouthful. So if anyone has questions about my early environmental experiences or the current work I do, I'm gonna open up a little bit of time to go over those things.
I don't see anything on the chat at the moment.
Cool. Well, I shall continue. So I created this opportunities page that I will share out with these slides. And on the far right-hand side, includes links. I feel like this is kind of specific to my personal experience. Please don't see it as a shout out specifically to the Nature Conservancy and CBF. While they're both great organizations, I encourage you to look into all sorts of organizations that may have opportunities. This is just elements of my own personal journey, as well as links for you to explore some of those opportunities. I would say one of the most standout opportunities that is at the bottom, the Chesapeake Conservation and Climate Corps. This is a development program. It mostly seeks like people freshly out of college. However, you do not have to have a college or associate's degree to be a part of the Climate Corps. It is a 1-year program where you are matched with a conservation organization in the DMV area. And during that 1 year, you have a job where you're paid and you do work day to day, but there's also professional development opportunities and opportunities to connect with other Climate Corps members to learn about their organizations and to feed off of their skills, which I think is really cool. I did not have the opportunity to be a part of the Chesapeake Conservation Climate Corps. It started in 2010, so it was definitely in existence when I graduated from college in 2019. However, I had no idea about it, and it's one of the few things where I was like, man, if I could go back in time, that's absolutely something that I think would have helped me along in my career. Another big standout to me is the Choose Clean Water Coalition, their Young Professionals of Color program. Most people just call it YPC. It is a mentorship opportunity for BIPOC individuals in the environmental field. And while you do not have to be BIPOC to join, it is geared towards diversifying conservation and having non-white people within this space. Although there are several people who are non-BIPOC who serve as mentors. And that's great too, because this field is still diversifying. And there's a lot more work to be done in that regard. So I got through this really quickly, which I'm very surprised I've already reached a conclusion. But here are my final tips and takeaways as you engage and start your career or your path to seek environmental justice or to have a career in conservation. The first would be to seek mentors and to maintain those relationships. I found out when I graduated college, I had a lot of skill, a lot of um, job opportunities that I had and skills that I built in jobs. But unfortunately, I didn't know anyone in the right spaces. And so I feel like currently my career has taken off because I've sought mentors and I've developed relationships with people and individuals from different organizations. and that has helped me a lot along my career. Another big thing is that I've been able to utilize the tasks that I enjoy and transition those tasks and those little things that I like to do into work. A big passion of mine is African American history. It's something that I love to research, not only because it's part of my personal story, but I find it is very intriguing because with the limited archival evidence, there's a lot of background research you need to know um, to make those conclusions, which I find to be very interesting. Another one that I did that most people probably won't recommend is to seek short-term opportunities. Like just because an opportunity may be short-term does not mean that it's finite and that it won't help your career. When I took on research for the Nature Conservancy, I didn't expect it to propel my career, but it absolutely did. Not solely from the skills that I developed in research, but in the connections I made with TNC employees, especially my supervisor at the time, who was an environmental educator. So she inspired me to take that next job as an environmental educator with CBF. Last but not least, I think in any field, in any career path, maintaining a strong work ethic and a networking system, but also just a little teeny bit of luck will help you along your journey. I think sometimes we tend to look at what other people are doing and judge our success off of others. But sometimes the context we leave out, sometimes people get things with a little bit of luck. And I want to acknowledge that as well.
There are a few questions on the chat now. The first one is, do you know the demographic stats for careers in climate and environmental justice field?
Yes. I don't know all of them offhand. I could start with CBF from my current experience within the organization. So with about 210 employees currently, I want to say 10 or less than 10 identify as Black. And I would say overall, maybe 20 individuals within this whole organization identify as BIPOC. So that includes Indigenous, Asian American, Latino, any non-white person. So I think those stats are still fairly off, wide off, but they stray far from the actual demographics of the DMV area and the states that we represent. However, we see this issue everywhere, right? From the health field, there being a lack of Black doctors, all the way into engineering in places like NASA, there's a lack of BIPOC engineers. I think many organizations are making steps to improve that. But you also have to view this in the context of educational opportunity. And with the recent changes to affirmative action on the college-bound space, that's a challenge and an obstacle that is hard to navigate in the nonprofit realm, right? If people are systemically preventing non-white people from receiving degrees, well, jobs that seek applicants that have college degrees or are as a result going to have less applicants of color.
And could you speak more to growing up in the Eastern Shore, Virginia, a little bit more? And what is life like for the Black community there today?
Oh, okay. This is where I really like to talk about. So I think there is a lot of misunderstanding of the Black rural identity. You all should know that the Eastern Shore of Virginia is a rural community. So along that 70-mile north to south stretch, um, pretty much anywhere you are on the Eastern Shore of Virginia, you can go 15 miles in either direction, east or west, and you'll hit either Atlantic coast or the Chesapeake Bay. So it is not only a rural area, but an isolated area. The Eastern Shore of Virginia is separated from the rest of the state. And as a result, the only way that Eastern Shore residents can go to the mainland of Virginia, is by crossing a 17-mile long bridge called the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. That has been an issue for residents of all races and backgrounds on the Eastern Shore, because when it comes to like health decisions and medical decisions, if you have any type of if you need any type of specialized care, you have to pay a $22 toll in addition to the probably $30 gas you have to pay just to get over to the 757 area, Virginia Beach, Norfolk. So that's one element of the Black as well as the total Eastern Shore experience. Everyone on the shore experienced that growing up. I think a lot of people associate rural places with whiteness, with farmers, with farming. Growing up, I didn't really see there being like a over prevalence or like a strong what I'm trying to say. Basically, the demographic gap on the Eastern Shore is not as wide as people think it is. So I would say from growing up in public schools, my schools were 30% Black, 30% white, 30% other. And by other, it encompasses a lot of groups. Immigrants from Central America, immigrants from Mexico, first generation Americans whose parents were from Latin America but grew up on the shore. And then we have a very substantial Haitian American population. The Eastern Shore of Maryland and Virginia actually has one of the largest Haitian immigrant populations in the country. And that starkly went up as well after the hurricanes in '08. So I didn't grow up feeling like being Black was isolating on Eastern Shore. I had my whole family there. I grew up in classrooms where I was often with white students. I didn't notice the difference in systemic issues of being a person of color until I really like got into middle school and high school and started to pursue advanced education opportunities. Then the demographics shifted abruptly. Even though I was in a school that was 30% Black, 30% white, I was the only Black girl in my classes. Well, statistically, that doesn't make sense, right? So that's part of my upbringing, my rural upbringing. I would say another big thing is there is lack of opportunities to understand the United States as a whole. An example I give that acknowledges my own bias is that many people in my family have very, very narrow eyes, right? Like my eyes are big. Many people in my family have narrow eyes, so more slanted, more narrow eyes. I did not grow up with any Asian Americans around me. So I use a slur starting with CH to refer to narrow eyes growing up. And it wasn't until I was in college that someone checked the fact that I was saying something that was a slur, and I had no idea. Um, and that wasn't because I came from a family that was prejudiced. That was because I solely did not have any interactions with Asian Americans growing up until college. Um, so yeah, I love the shore. There is still a strong farming aspect to the shore, but it has transitioned to the feed for a lot of animals, so corn and soybeans, as well as the raising of chickens. A really big environmental issue we have on the shore is we have two of the biggest chicken plants, Tyson's and Purdue, and we feel the impacts of those raising chickens on an industrial scale, and the runoff from that. That's been a big issue on the shore for decades now. Hopefully I
And
answered that person's question.
Maddie has her hand raised. You want to ask your question?
Yeah, I'm able to turn that on. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yes. You're muted now. It may help to type the question.
In the meantime, I see Sandra Mackey has a question. Sandra, would you like to
Yes.
come off mute in the meantime and ask your question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for your presentation. I have a question. You mentioned the short-term opportunities. Would you have, or is it worth pursuing like a part-time weekend opportunity that was strictly volunteering? Does that exist for people that just have part-time opportunities, especially volunteering?
Yes. So on the document that I included, I know the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, shameless plug for the organization I work for, we do have weekend opportunities for tree plantings. That's big right now in the spring, as well as oyster gardening. I'm happy to say that some of those opportunities are on the shore if you happen to be on the rural side of the state. I will be sending these slides to your professor, Professor Cardona. So hopefully she can disperse that so you'll have access to those links. I would look into other organizations as well. If you're Maryland-based, Nature Forward is an organization that we've worked with that's pretty great. I don't think the trust does any volunteer opportunities. There's quite a few. I'm gonna say if I stop sharing my screen right now, there's a web page. Let's see. Hold on a second.
I'm writing my email down on the chat just in case.
I'm going to share a job board. I would say it's important that sometimes on job boards you'll just see jobs. Utilize it as an opportunity to see what organizations are out there. And just by going to the organization's official website, you can often find internship opportunities as well. So I'm gonna copy this link. Give me 1 second here.
There are a few questions on the chat as well. It says here, you mentioned the switch from DEIJ committee to the Stripes Waves initiative, but how else has this current regime's executive orders and edicts affected your work?
So I don't have access to says I'm not a member of the chat, so I can't drop that link. But what was the question regarding the name change from DEIJ to the Waves Committee?
How else has the administration's executive orders affected your work?
That is a great question. So I would say the Trump administration's executive orders have impacted CBF on a smaller scale than many other organizations because the majority of our operational funds come from membership, right? So that's people who donate to CBF upon passing, as well as people who regularly donate to CBF on a monthly basis and other small time donations. So because CBF has a large pocket of its resource money, not given by federal funds, we are somewhat blunted, have a blunted impact by the Trump administration. However, it varies significantly by department. So my department, the Community and Partnerships Department, only have about 10% of our funds from grant funding, arguably funding that it wouldn't collapse our department if it disappeared. Whereas many of our departments, such as education, it relies on state and federal funds, as well as environmental protection and restoration, which encompasses our people who do agricultural work with our farmers, initiating cover crop policies and ways to prevent runoff into the bay, people who engage in research and oyster restoration, oyster planning, water quality research. So that department, a more significant amount of their funding is grant funding and has impacted their strategy more significantly. I'd also like to state that in the context of all this executive order stuff, CBF actually just concluded our strategic planning process. So that was a 5-year process of self-evaluating as well as having external partners evaluate the policies and the way we accomplish the policies of CBF. And with that being done, many departments within CBF were planning the change anyway. For example, my boss, my supervisor, her title change was confirmed in November, a lot prior to some of this executive order stuff. So yes, we have been impacted, especially departments that have received grant funding. Yes, we have implemented some changes, but I see these changes as proactive rather than reactive. In changing our committee name from DEIJ to WAVES, it was membership led. It was led by the members of the committee. It was not top down. It was not the VP or president of any department saying, hey, you need to change, but hey, we use DEIJ as an acronym way too much anyway. What's the name that better suits this committee? And a staff member did recommend that acronym WAVES. working to achieve our values in every space.
Here's another question. I'm really interested in pursuing a career in urban design. I was wondering if there's anything you think is important to see incorporated in the way our cities are designed in terms of land use and environmental justice.
Ooh, that is a big one. Okay, so you're seeking a degree in environmental design. What do I see as important in land use and environmental justice? Well, we were kind of having this discussion at work today. Some colleagues in the education department, as well as the communities and partnerships department, we were talking about food in Baltimore City and old Lexington Market versus new Lexington Market. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Baltimore City, but Lexington Market had a really big renovation. And my boss mentioned how she loves all the vendors there. She'll always love Lexington Market, but the vibe has changed. I can see that mirroring some of the type of environmental issues that we have. A place where I grew up called Cape Charles, Virginia, is one of the few places on the Eastern Shore that has a free public access beach. Something crazy like 97% of waterfront property along the Chesapeake Bay is privately owned. That means you need to have a personal relationship or permission from a landowner to even access the beach. Cape Charles Beach is one of the few, and still is one of the few places on the shore that has a public beach. It also was one of the few places that had government subsidized housing as well as low income housing. And in the past decade, those OG residents of Cape Charles, who are oftentimes Black, were pushed out for the formation of luxury waterfront property, as well as storefront property being transitioned to, like, tourist things, knickknacks. And it's a double-edged sword because while jobs are opening up in these areas, where there's sort of this thriving summer tourism environment, there's also the lack of representation of the first people who live there and what the true demographics of the Eastern Shore look like. I see it mirrored in like Baltimore as an example as well, like the formation of the Red Line. I don't know if you're familiar with that project, but in the early 2000s, it was proposed to create a public train that would go east to west in Baltimore. Unlike its current public train system, it solely goes south to north and not very effectively. It's a double-edged sword of people in a county feeling like, oh, people from the city are going to invade the county, and people from the city are rightfully stating that they just want to get to work every day. In CVF's role, I see there being opportunities for community involvement and community understanding in land use changes. A big project that we have is oyster restoration and oyster farming. And oftentimes this work is done in areas that has the poorest water quality or areas that have a transitional nature, like the Baltimore Peninsula and all the changes that's happened on the waterfront. So while I'm not anti-development, I am pro community involvement. Hope that answers your question. I don't think I'll ever have the answer.
Yes, it's it. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Yes. So we had a question on one of our recent modules about the Great Pacific trash collection, and the question was, who is responsible? Who do you think should be responsible? One country, since it's in international waters. What individual country or what country should be responsible? I just wanted to know what your opinion was about that.
Ooh, that is a great
And
question.
this is Stephen Mitchell, by the way. I'm
Thank
sorry,
you,
this is Stephen Mitchell, by the way. I'm sorry, I thought I had to get my name.
Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate your question. I think that question mirrors a lot of questions in the environmental justice movement, and that is who has the right to develop and who does not? Who has the right to pollute and who does not? I don't think any individual nation should be held responsible for the Great Pacific Trash Island. What is it called? Great Pacific Trash Blob. I do think corporations should be held liable for that. So one of the biggest is Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola has known for decades that their plastic bottles are not ending up in everywhere but landfills half the time. Um, and they have stated, oh, 80% of our bottles are made from recycled materials, and they put out all this greenwashing propaganda. But the reality of the situation is that they're never going to stop selling Coke in plastic bottles, and those plastic bottles will continue to end up in our waterways and our oceans. So I think real change is made by putting pressure on corporations. However, many states, cities, and federal politicians have economic incentives to not put the pressure on those corporations. Hopefully that answers your question, Steve.
Absolutely. I teach at a middle school and they call me the resident conspiracy theorist. So I wanted to make sure I had actually some facts so I could just be labeled as a theorist and not a conspiracy theorist. Because I agree wholeheartedly with you, especially with some of the corporate sponsors. So yes, thank you for your opinion on that.
Yeah, and so many of the corporate sponsors, as you mentioned, are like they're represented in multiple countries, right? So places could put up legislation against Coca-Cola USA, but Coca-Cola Singapore is still going to be able to accomplish whatever they want. So it can be very tricky in that regard. If you're passionate about this subject, I encourage you to look up what do they call it? Environmental economic credits, where you can put your money to corporations pay to put their money towards environmental projects like solar, wind, to offset their economic damage. Ecological damage, but they're not really effective. And I think it also ties into first world or developed nations versus developing nations' right to pollute, right? America, some of our biggest environmental degradation took place when we were building our railroads and when we were building our first interstate highway systems. So we've kind of got that down. It's been accomplished already. Whereas nations are developing their highways and developing their rail networks, what makes it so that they don't have the right to develop, right? I think it's a great question.
Here's another question. Have you written a book on this? It's a great topic and resource from a Black perspective.
Ooh, well, thank you. I by no means am I an author, but I can shout out a colleague who has also featured Brownsville Preserve. He referenced my article, so I do have an article that is linked in the slides that I will send. So I have been published in the Nature Conservancy magazine, as well as my colleague Ian Post at Salisbury University just published a chapter in a book today. I literally just got the email, so forgive me while
Well, we
pull
also
it
have
up.
a follow-up question that's related. If folks want to learn more about BIPOC involvement in environmental and climate justice, what books or sources would you recommend?
Ooh, I have a really, really thick book from undergrad. It's one of my favorite books. It's actually not about environmental justice. It's actually about the enslavement of African Americans in the Chesapeake Low Country, as well as the Carolinas. And it covers how African Americans were some of the first oyster divers in the country, um, separating us from this myth that like Black people can't swim. Well, that's not the truth. We were some of the first oyster divers in the nation, so we had to be strong swimmers to do that. And it covers how the land use during enslavement has fundamentally has been core to the development of the U.S. that we see today. I have to Google that, but the book that I'm referring to that has my colleagues Ian Post's Brownsville research, as well as excerpts from other researchers that focus on Black history, it is called From Interrogation to Integration, Centering Social Justice in Special Collections, Archives, and Preservation. The author there is Kim Hoffman. I wish I had access to your chat so I could like copy it.
If you want to, you could share those links with me on email and I can forward it to whoever requests it.
Okay, I'll start that email now. Thank you, Professor Cardone.
Here's another question. Do you actively participate in building artificial reefs for the oysters in the Chesapeake Bay?
I do not actively participate in that program. I'm actually quite busy. Many of our oyster restoration staff, they are full-time staff. That's all they do. They network and organize with restaurants and places that utilize a lot of oysters. They collect those oyster shells. They develop the oyster spat. Then they plant the oyster spat in the oyster shells. I have not actively participated in that. However, I'm very familiar with that. I've worked with some of our oyster staff on our boats. And as a former member of our education department, I know how to dissect oysters. I'm very familiar with oysters' use as filter feeders and improving the water quality of the Chesapeake Bay. I'm familiar with the indigenous history of oysters. A lot of people don't know that when John Smith, when John Smith first charted the Chesapeake Bay, when he was coming through the bay, the oysters were so prevalent that boats could run aground on oysters. They actually formed reefs that were tall enough to like stick out of the water. And the water quality was actually so great that you could see about 20 feet down at that time. So I'm pretty informed about the history and the utility of oysters. I just don't actively engage with them every day in my day-to-day work, just because it's not necessary. We have such a number of staff and volunteers who do that every day. Great question, though. If you're interested, you can get involved. It is linked in the slides that I will send to your professor and she'll disperse. I love that question. It was actually really great.
Can you hear me?
You're Mhm. Yes.
Okay. I was going to type a really long thing. I included in the chat a link to the book site, so that can at least be a starting point for other participants, because there was another book with a very similar title. So I'm glad I looked. But also I was going to say that Maryland Public Television also does quite a good job, not only in their regular programming, but special programming. I'm going to say during the pandemic, their Earth Day programming talked about the presence of Indigenous persons and their consumption of oysters and how they had techniques that basically replenish the shoreline, with the shells in certain parts of the bay as well. So I tried to find it just now when I looked up, but so many things came up I couldn't couldn't find it. So I don't know if it was Chesapeake Bay by Air or if it was the special Earth Day program. There's also something called Eroding History that you may be familiar with. And I know there was a PBS special, I'm not sure if it was MPT, but about Black watermen on the Chesapeake. So for other participants, those are some things that are very good starting points and more recent broadcasts, that you might be able to explore.
Thank you. And I want to shout out the Blacks of the Chesapeake nonprofit that was formerly led by Vince Leggett, who passed away recently. They have a lot of good local history on Black watermen, and we do partner with them to allow them to use our CBF offices as necessary. We have a good relationship with that organization, and it is awesome to see Black-led organizations spearheading their own history. So shameless plug to Blacks of the Chesapeake if you want to look them up. In regards to the previous question about volunteer opportunities, a website I really recommend, and I will send your professor the link, is chesapeakenetwork.org/job-board. If you just type in chesapeakenetwork.org, I'm sure you can find the job board page. That is a really good place to not only look for jobs, but to see the names of nonprofits, because from there you can just type in the name of the nonprofit and see if they have volunteer opportunities. We still got 4 minutes. I got time for more questions.
There's some links being shared on the chat for, I'm assuming.
Yeah,
Some of
since I
these are books.
need to look up that book about,
Then
it was really, really thick, the one that I enjoyed. It's like 400 pages.
the Chesapeake Network and the Blacks of the Chesapeake Bay links were shared.
Thank you. I can't view the chat or anything at all, so thanks for letting me know.
Yeah, I think it might be because you're outside of the CCBC network.
Oh, no worries. It happens sometimes.
Does anyone else have any questions?
The name of
wanna
the
thank-
book
Mhm.
is Slave Counterpoint, Black Culture in the 18th Century Chesapeake and Low Country by Philip D. Morgan. It is intimidating by the width of that book, but you can skip and just read certain chapters, and it was like one of the most illuminating books I've ever read. It was published in 1998 by University of North Carolina. Author Philip D. Morgan.
I wanted to thank everyone for coming, especially Vanessa, but also I want to reiterate that there's I'm going to just copy and edit again, but there's a link to a survey, and I would really appreciate if everyone would take their time to fill out this survey link that allows us to continue to host events like this. And that way we are also getting your opinions on how well these are advertised and, how they're run. So I really appreciate your time. Students who do fill this out are entered to win $25 in a gift card to a bookstore, a local bookstore, something like Greedy Reads. And someone just shared the link to the book that you just mentioned. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording at this time.
Thank you.